Hello, I'm Arif. Welcome to Asian Agribiz podcast. Over the past few years, the livestock industry has faced unprecedented challenges due to the impact of diseases such as African swine fever and avian influenza. For those in our audience who attended Asian Agribiz Living with African Swine Fever Blueprint for the Future conference in 2021 will remember the stress on biosecurity and pathogen mitigation in feed to stop the spread of the disease. My colleague Zahra Imtiaz once again revisits this topic with Dr. Simon Carlton from Anitox and take a look at how feedmill biosecurity can be improved on to make your feed safe for consumption.
Hi, Simon. Thank you for joining our podcast today. To start off with, why don't you tell our audiences about a bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. Well, I've been involved in agriculture all my life. I am from England, but I've worked in Denmark in the pig industry. I've worked in Australia and New Zealand. And I'm back. I lived in Australia and New Zealand for 4 years in total. And I came back to the UK many years ago now and worked for a pig breeding company for 15 years. Worked for a feed company, a national compounder in the UK for 8 years. And I've been with Anitox for almost 14 years now. In fact, just over 14 years.
That's great. So you're the best person to talk to us about the topic today. So we're talking about a disease-free feed mill. And as an expert, we will look at the cost of doing nothing in terms of biosecurity at the farm is very high, because especially as we see the impact of diseases such as AI and ASF across the region. We know this, but can you explain to us why a biosecure feed mill is important in terms of the broader context of farm biosecurity?
Sure. So most producers will take many precautions against pathogens entering or becoming established on their farms. And that will include things like the careful selection of the stock they're buying, the breeding stock, and they'll sometimes be isolating incoming stock in quarantine. They'll limit the visitors and they'll follow strict visitor protocols. They'll have fencing around their sites. They'll do rigorous clean downs and disinfectant regimes after houses or pens are emptied. They'll have things like disinfectant foot dips, anti-vermin traps and regimes, and of course water treatment such as chlorine, UV treatment, etc. So they'll go to great lengths to make sure that they're as biosecure as they can be. But what many producers don't check is what their own mill or their feed supplier is doing to stop pathogens contaminating the feed. And they sometimes forget what a risk feed presents to farm biosecurity, as feed is coming onto the farm every week and it comes into contact with every animal on the farm. So any pathogens present in the feed will be eaten by the animals. So the actions a mill does or doesn't take to remain biosecure, not just in the mill, but also in the transport to the farm, can have a big impact on all of the farms that they supply. So that's why it's such an important aspect that they're thinking of, not just the farmers are not just thinking about what they're doing, but what is happening with the feed that's coming onto their farm.
That's true. I mean, when you spoke about the farm biosecurity, you highlighted many disinfection points. I mean, this is something even feed millers think of when it comes to feed mills, and that is basically it. They think about keeping their feed mills clean. But is there more to this? how comprehensive should we be when we talk of biosecurity? And why is risk assessment and planning important?
Well, keeping feed mills clean is really important. And by that, I mean using a vacuum cleaner to clean dust levels, to keep those dust levels right down, and making sure that any spillages are cleaned up, and that any dirt that might be coming in from raw material wagons and the mill's delivery wagons is cleaned off where possible before they enter the intake pit or to the loadout gantry. Another important biosecurity measure is controlling vermin, so including mice, rats, birds, etc., which are vectors for various pathogens, including things like salmonella, avian influenza, and so on. So mice, rats, and bait boxes and traps should be positioned outside buildings or raw material feed storage areas, and they should be regularly monitored and recharged with vermin control bait when necessary. Bird netting should be used, or raw material intake feed store doors used to keep birds out. There's always that risk of birds coming in and defecating, which could have salmonella contamination or things like avian influenza contamination just onto the feed, just onto the raw materials as they come into the mill. And the other thing to be aware of is to make sure that any perch areas inside the mill, or particularly inside the intake area, should be modified to make it difficult or impossible for birds to perch on, so that just to dissuade them from starting to kind of roost in the intake area. And I've seen that plenty of times. Risk assessment is important, and it is part of the HACCP, Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point program all mills should follow. Biosecurity risks or hazards need to be assessed for all parts of the mill, and critical control points should be determined. So establish what risk raw materials and other fomites and vectors pose regarding introducing pathogens to the mill, and also which pathogens could be introduced. Once you've established what the risks are, you can look at what mitigations you can employ to control the risks and where in the mill they should be introduced. And you asked about planning. Planning is always important, and that starts with mill design in how, as I was referring to earlier, things like whether you've got doors or netting for your intake area, but it's right across the whole design of the mill. But it also includes where you're sourcing your raw materials from. So you need to be asking your supplier, your raw material supplier, okay, so where are these coming from? What's the risk? What mitigations are you as the raw material supplier taking to make sure the raw materials you're supplying me aren't contaminated with pathogens? And then what disinfectants, the mill needs to be thinking about what disinfectants and other mitigants to use, and when and where to use them, and kind of planning ahead for that.
There are two things that I found very interesting. It is mill design. Mill design is not something you think of when you think of biosecurity. Could you elaborate more on that?
Well, things like the design of the conveyors. Are there any dead spots? And so typically more modern mills will have conveyors where you have an elevator with a boot, so the foot of the elevator will, in olden days, they often would have a boot which just filled up, so that's the bottom of the elevator, it would just fill up with food and or with whatever raw material or meal or pellets were being transported. And so there was the danger then that you just get this old, and it can get slightly damp meal or residue just sitting at the bottom of an elevator, and that can become a really good source for pathogens. They can just, particularly if you get any moisture, you get any mold forming there. As soon as you get mold, that starts to create some moisture, and then you get bacteria forming there. So the design the design of the equipment that you're using in the mill, and then how well the mill flows, what insulation you've got in the mill. So, for instance, you've got a heat stage in a mill where you're pelleting, or if you've got a heat stage because you're producing breeder feed, for instance, and you need to heat feed for a particular period of time, and that can be from 2 minutes up to 6 minutes at 86 centigrade, that type of regime, which some mills producing breeder feed will use. So you've got this heat stage area, and then the meal goes to the cooler. And if you don't insulate the conveyor between the heat stage and the cooler, then you can get a lot of condensation at that particular point. As soon as you get condensation, you've got moisture, you've got ideal conditions for pathogens. So thinking about how that mill is going to operate, how close you're going to have the cooler to the heat stage, how you're going to insulate the different vessels that carry the feed around, and particularly carry hot feed around, what you do with the air coming out of the cooler to try and make sure you duct that away, and you're minimizing the chance of pathogens getting established in that area as well. They are all things you should be thinking about when you're right at the very beginning, if you're going to be building a mill. And if you've already got your mill, and you're trying to make it more biosecure after it's already been built, then those are the kind of areas you need to be looking at.
And thank you. And there was another point you highlighted about the types of disinfection used. You must think of that. Now, I mean, there are basic disinfections like, keeping things clean and bacteria and stuff, but now we also worry about viruses and such as like ASF and things also going through feed. How do you think that can be controlled? I mean, even the most modern feed mills can carry these diseases, like even salmonella.
Yes, they can. So there are, I mean, it's a very good question, Zara. The types of in-feed disinfectants, some feed, when you heat it, the pathogens are easily controlled. So avian influenza is one of those. Avian influenza, you can knock it down really quite quickly with a short heat stage. But salmonella is a lot more resistant, and ASF is particularly resistant. And there are viruses have different, some of them are resistant to heat and others aren't. So having some form of a disinfectant stage, a mitigant that can control viruses and bacteria is really important. And obviously that's the area we focus on. But using a product which can control viruses and bacteria is a really important way of ensuring you maintain your biosecurity.
That's great. I think that it's kind of connected to my last question, but like I'll ask you it here. Why is it then important to look at biosecurity from raw material to finished product? I mean, the whole chain, and how does this affect the overall product integrity?
Okay, yeah, so you brought me right onto recontamination, because that's the big issue. Some mills treat incoming raw material, high risk raw materials at intake. So things like rape meal, soya meal, sunflower meal, they tend to be, or meat and bone meal if you're in a country where you're using where you're allowed to use animal proteins. But any of the protein, the high protein raw materials tend to be higher risk from things like salmonella particularly, but not just salmonella, Clostridia, and some things like viruses. Obviously, if you're using meat and bone meal, those particularly if they come from pigs, obviously, that can be very high risk. So they'll treat them at intake as a way of trying to make sure they're not then spreading any of those pathogens through the mill. But if you don't do anything about the risk of cross-contamination, then you're in you're potentially going to be subject to recontamination. So you'll recontaminate. You've done the treatment, you spent the money, but if you don't pay any attention to this recontamination risk, all that time, that money and the effort can be wasted. So that's when you need a mitigant that is able to protect against recontamination. It's going to be far more useful than one that isn't. So really, the reason to look at biosecurity from raw material to finished product is about protecting against recontamination. That's the big risk.
What kind of mitigants can we specifically use? I mean, how does that work?
Well, there are mitigants which have the ability to remain active. So I'm talking about kind of chemical type treatments that you can apply, and you can either apply them at intake, but more commonly they're applied in the mixer. So chemicals which are able to remain active, and if the treated feed comes back into contact with pathogens at a later stage in the mill, and so typically in a mill producing pellets, for instance, you have a heat stage that can kill certainly any avian influenza, but it won't necessarily kill all the salmonella. But if you treat it for long enough, it will kill all the salmonella. If you treat feed for 6 minutes at 86 degrees centigrade, and some mills do this if they're supplying breeder farms, that will kill all the salmonella. The issue is that within a couple of seconds, the feed can be recontaminated in the cooler. And so what you're looking for is some form of a mitigant which is able to remain active. Just using a heat stage that has no protection against recontamination. But if you're using a mitigant which has this ability to protect, to remain active, and to control subsequent contamination, you're in a much better place.
And I mean, you must also ensure it does not affect your pellet quality, because I mean, heat can also, I think, has an impact on the final end product. Yes,
yeah, you're right. I mean, typically companies which are using heat stages for that long, they're normally feeding a meal anyway, because it'd be going to breeders. So it's not always the case, but it's usually, if they're using a heat stage for a long time, like a 6-minute heat stage, that's usually meal, but not always. But the issue you have actually is that you damage some of the nutrients. And so what you end up having to do, it's an expensive process when you're going to use a 6-minute heat stage. You end up having to put in some more nutrients. You have what's called an overage. So you've got to actually put some more in because you know you're going to lose some because of the how rigorous that heat regime is. And you certainly, if you're using liquid disinfectants, such as the ones we manufacture, you want to be making sure that those disinfectants aren't having any effect on the feed or on the quality. If you were to ask me, okay, if you want to go and find pathogens in a mill, Simon, where would you go? Well, I'd go to intake, first of all. I'd go to the cooler and the sieves, the return conveyor, and I'd go to the loadout area. Those are the 3 high risk areas. That's where I'm most likely to find pathogens. And so those are the keeping all of those areas clean, not just those areas, but those are 3 of the most important areas you really need to be focusing on.
Oh, with so many areas it can cause risk, I suppose it's a good thing to have a plan. So finally, I mean, these are so many areas that one feed miller has to look into, and you have disinfection, you have to invest in manpower and things like that. So the question is, can you be cost effective and biosecure? Are these 2 things not, I mean, are they contradictory? Like, can we actually accommodate both?
Well, the short answer is yes, you can. But to give you a more comprehensive answer, if you're not biosecure, you're running a big risk of incurring high costs through the introduction of what could be both clinical and subclinical disease, either onto your own farms if you're an integrated mill, or if you're a commercial mill, onto your customers' farms. Your customers aren't going to thank you for delivering pathogens such as Salmonella, avian influenza, E. coli, Clostridia, African swine fever, PRRS, porcine epidemic diarrhea virus. All of these can be transmitted, and not just those, but they can all be transmitted by feed onto farms. So yeah, it's going to be cost effective if you if you're being biosecure, you're going to be reducing the risk by a tremendous amount of introducing disease onto your farms or your customers' farms if you're a commercial mill. Furthermore, you are likely to fail any biosecure audits, which are going to be conducted by your customers, and that could include your customers audited by retailers. So the retailers will be coming around quite often to audit mills. They certainly do in Europe. And then feed industry codes of practice will typically have areas they'll want to know what biosecure measures you're taking. They'll want to look at those and examine what you're doing, what your records are, how are you going about it, what preventive actions you're taking, what are you doing in case any pathogens are found. So yes, it's certainly cost effective to make sure you're being biosecure. There's no doubt about that.
Okay, thank you so much, Simon. And to wrap it all up, do you have any takeaway messages for our audiences?
Think about the risks of recontamination in your mill and be looking for products which can protect against recontamination. It's not just in the mill, of course, it's also in the transport or actually on the farm. So if you can your customers are going to thank you if you're using products which can give you that kind of protection, which will last for 14 days plus. So the treated feed, the feed that you treat with that product, can remain protected because the product you're using gives you active protection against recontamination. That's a really important one.
Thank you. I'm sure that's a great message to take away for our audience. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for inviting me to your call.
Hope you all got those take-home messages next time you visit your feed mill, because biosecurity risks emerge in the little things you miss. Thank you for listening to Asian Agribiz podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you get your podcasts.